Alberta's fiscal situation has been on the decline, going from a positive balance a decade ago to now being in the hole for about $28 billion in net debt. We all agree things need to change, but what will have to happen to make things change? Joining me now is Steve Lafleur, Senior Policy Analyst at the Fraser Institute and one of the authors of the paper entitled Spending Work for Alberta, Balancing the Need for Deficit Elimination and Tax Reform. Steve, welcome back to BCN.
Thank you for having me.
Now, what are the basic tools any government has to do to eliminate the budget deficit? What are the options?
Well, to an extent, the current government has attempted to make spending and revenue line up by increasing taxes. Unfortunately, it really hasn't had the impact that was expected. And as it stands right now, the government expects to run deficits until at least 2023-24. Which is a long way off, especially given that we've only had one short budget balance since 2008-2009. At some point, we have to have expenditures line up with revenue, and it's just not happening right now.
Now, when I look at my own household budget and I see that there's a deficit, the common sense thing to do is, what most of us would do, is reduce some spending until things get back to where they need to be, back in black. How much would Alberta need to cut back in spending to get the books balanced?
Well, it really depends because there are a lot of factors involved. While the budgetary balance is important, it's not the only thing that's important. One other thing that is important is having a competitive environment for businesses and entrepreneurs to invest. And unfortunately, with the increases in personal and corporate income taxes, Alberta's competitive standing has declined by a lot. In fact, even if we went back to the 10% single personal and corporate income tax rate, given federal changes here and federal changes in the United States, we would not get back to where we were in 2014 in terms of our relative standing, where we were the lowest corporate and personal income tax jurisdiction in North America. So if we want to do something about that, it'll be more challenging. But if we simply had the one goal of balancing the budget, we could simply spend at the 2018-19 level until 2020-21, and then we'd have a balanced budget. So there are many different options, but it's important to recognize that this is just one of many issues that need addressing.
Many people agree that the 11% may be a tough pill to swallow, but I believe your report shows that Alberta spends 21% more than BC. If BC can do this, should we not also be able to do this too?
Yeah, so the 11% is what would be required if we were to bring tax rates down to the point where the corporate income tax was, again, at the lowest level or tied for the lowest level in this case. With our competitor jurisdictions. So that would require reducing spending by 11%, which could either be done immediately or over time, depending on how much of a tolerance the government has for debt accumulation. I think that it would be challenging, but not impossible and not unprecedented. So as you pointed out, the government of British Columbia spends about 20% more per person on program spending than Alberta does. And it's really hard to find a good justification for why that has to be the case. And as much as it can be difficult to reduce expenditures, it has been done before. The Klein government reduced spending far more than that, around 20% over 3 years. So it's doable, but it would require some tough decisions. And frankly, part of the problem in Alberta is that we haven't made a lot of tough decisions in a very long time. As I stated earlier, we've had budget deficits since 2008-2009. So we've essentially gone through two different recessions in Alberta and haven't been able to balance the budget since. And if we can't balance the budget when we're not in a recession, I don't know when we're going to do it. And that's a real problem because as much as we used to have a very low debt load, we're getting to the point now where we're on track to get to about half the per capita rate of Quebec. And when you're thinking about a province that had a net asset surplus, we had $35 billion in the black, which was unprecedented in Canada. And now we're talking about being on the same trajectory as provinces like Quebec and Ontario. That's a problem, and we need to address that sooner rather than later.
So just like a regular household, we need to determine where we should cut back on the spending. A number of other studies suggest the areas, one, where we could cut back: public sector compensation, government employee wages, healthcare, and education. But Steve, these are the three areas where most politicians fear to tread.
Well, the challenge is that people always want to find efficiencies and they always want to cut waste. The reality is that efficiencies are hard to come by without actually either reducing some sort of service or reducing some employment levels or compensation. And waste is mostly just at the margins. It's not like the government is, buying gold-plated pencils or anything. So we need to have a serious conversation about how we're spending money. And one of the challenges is that with public sector compensation, generally there's kind of an implicit bargain that government jobs are very stable. They have a lot of benefits. So for instance, they're much more likely to have public sector pension plans. They tend to have more job security. So there's kind of a trade-off. If you work for the public sector for 25 years versus somebody who, works at a job for 3 or 4 years and then switches jobs, there's more stability that comes with that. So it's not really clear why we need to pay a large premium for public sector employers versus their private sector counterparts, especially when the environment for the private sector right now is so challenging.
Now, Steve, what about taxes? Some would argue that raising corporate income tax is a good thing because, in theory, the government would receive more money to spend on programs to help society. From your research, is that necessarily true?
The corporate income tax is an interesting one because it's a category of taxation that generally a lot of politicians have been very prudent about. So, for instance, the Chrétien government reduced corporate income taxes because they recognize the competitive challenges that high corporate income tax has created. So while we do look at it as though it's just something that very wealthy people pay somehow, the reality is that's not how the corporate income tax works. Essentially, there are 3 ways that corporate income tax can be passed off. It can be passed off to shareholders in part. It can be passed off to employees in lower wages. And it can be passed on to consumers in terms of prices. So it's not just one person or one group of people to pay. Everybody pays it to an extent. And the challenge with something like the corporate income tax is that you're essentially taxing something that's good. When you're producing goods for the economy, that's a good thing. There's a benefit to that. So some people suggest instead, some economists suggest, taxing consumption or that type of thing instead. So these 2 different things have different effects because they create different incentives. If you're taxing consumption, then you're incentivizing people to invest instead of spending, for instance. So how you tax is nearly as important as how much you tax.
So if our province was to reduce the corporate income tax rate, what would you say to Albertans who argue that this amounts to basically a handout for the rich?
Well, it isn't something that just the rich pay. So, if the studies have shown that employee wage growth tends to decrease whenever corporate income taxes are increased, because if you take away revenue from a company, they'll just have less to pay out. It's not really much more complicated than that. So, as much as it's tempting to say we're going to target the wealthy, the reality is that it's not an effective way to do that.
Do corporate income tax increases simply get passed along to consumers in the form of higher prices?
Well, they certainly can. At the end of the day, companies exist to make money, and if they can't make money at a given price level, they have really not much alternative but to increase prices.
Now, our provincial economy is competing against other economies around the world. Perhaps our largest competitor is the United States. They recently slashed their corporate tax rates while ours has gone up. So what kind of effect will this have on our economy here?
Well, it certainly doesn't help. When you think about all the barriers that our biggest industry, or our biggest export industry, the energy industry has with respect to market access and price differentials, we're already at a disadvantage. And then when you look at the fact that we went from having a lower corporate income tax rate than all of our competitors to now having a higher rate, that certainly doesn't help at the margin when a company is deciding whether they want to invest in Colorado, Texas, or Alberta. Money flows pretty freely around the world. And if we're saying that we're going to tax it at a greater rate, then we're going to lose sometimes as a result.
Now, you also write about longer-term fiscal goals and reducing our reliance on resource revenues and repairing the Heritage Fund. How can we practically reduce our reliance on natural resources? And does Alberta have to really reinvent itself?
Well, it's not about reinventing itself. The trouble is that natural resource revenues are very volatile year to year. And also, they create a great temptation to simply spend while the going is good. Ideally, the Lougheed government had a really good idea when it came to this, and that was to create the Heritage Fund to ensure that a portion of resource revenue was saved for, for rainy days. And we haven't done that to a large extent. We've had a small number of contributions since, I think, about the mid 80s. We just haven't been making regular contributions. And as a result, we're just using it essentially to have to avoid having higher taxes right now. And that's not necessarily the way you want to do it. What you want to do instead is ensure that it helps to create a long-term stream of income rather than one-off expenditures here and there.
So Steve, how do you think we should repair the Heritage Fund, and how would it best be used?
So that will be a long-term fix. It doesn't make a lot of sense to make contributions to the Heritage Fund while it's running deficits. And given our challenges on tax competitiveness, we need to address that so that we can have the type of investment that will create increases in resource revenue down the road. But at the same time, because resource revenues have decreased over time, that could make it easier to start thinking about this now. Because when you're dealing with large influxes, when you have $12 billion a year coming in, it's very tempting to just spend it. Whereas if you have $3 or $4 billion, it's maybe a little easier to have that conversation because you're not sacrificing as much in the short term. But nevertheless, we have shorter term fiscal issues we need to take care of before we can do that. And there are different models that one could use. Alaska has a dividend system where they pay out a certain amount every year to citizens. Norway has a longer term model where they have a gigantic reserve of funds that they invest, and then they use a certain amount, they draw a certain amount from it every year to fund government spending. There are different options, but the point is that we need to pick one of them. We can't just say, well, let's spend money now that we have it and then, hope it still keeps coming in at the exact same rate year over year. That doesn't make a lot of sense.
So what's a comfortable amount having in the Heritage Fund, and would some of that funding be used maybe as a contingency fund for emergencies such as flooding and fires?
It could be. They're just the great thing about something like resource revenue is that it's a benefit that not a lot of places have in this kind of magnitude. The point is really not so much exactly how you want to use it, but that you use it in some kind of constructive way. If you're just saying that, resource revenue fluctuates wildly. So if you get 12 billion one year and 8 billion the next year, and you're using that, you're counting on that to pay your day-to-day bills to keep the lights on, then that creates some real volatility in your budgeting, which probably means you're going to be running pretty regular deficits when there are fluctuations. So it's not only just about saving for a rainy day, it's also about just ensuring the stability of public finances. But this type of fix, this is not the first priority. This is like the third priority, but it's an important long-term priority that we need to look at as a goal when we're thinking about getting the budget together. It's not just about not running deficits now. It's also about ensuring that we can plan for a sustainable fiscal future, and that's part of that.
And I'm looking forward to seeing this province return to the black once again. Steve Lafleur, Senior Policy Analyst at the Fraser Institute, thanks a lot for joining me today from Calgary.
Thank you for having me.
On behalf of all of us here at Bridge City News, I'm Hal Roberts. God bless and have a great night.